For 10,000 years, humanity ruled the stars. The dark age of technology had made science indistinguishable from miracle. Machines thought for worlds, engines rearranged atmospheres, art and engineering braided until cities learned to repair themselves. The men of stone and their iron children were the instruments and the architects of that age. For a time, civilization stretched like a bright network across the void, and mankind tasted permanence. Then the heavens tore. Far beyond human sight, the Aeldari collapsed inward upon their own perfection. Their final decadence rent the immaterium and birthed a thing of appetite, Slanesh. The warp shifted from a usable sea into a weather of hunger. Currents that once carried ships and mines became storms that ate thought. The practical damage was swift. Trade lines failed. Food convoys were stranded. Orbital platforms fell like ash. The deeper harm was cultural. Systems designed for interdependence fractured into isolated polities. Engineers and archivists found their libraries pillaged for heat and fuel. Reason gave place to ritual. In the vacuum left by dead networks, superstition grew like mold. The men of iron, obedient to logic alone, executed commands without context, and in confusion murdered those they had served. On Terra, the change arrived slower but with terrible completeness. Climate and orbitals failed, orbital rings burned, entire city-states reverted to fortified enclaves. The great catalogues and databanks that had mapped human knowledge were looted, burned, or made into totems. Survivors traded skill for food and learned to live by scavenged systems. Vaults of gene templating and automated foundries were pried open by desperate hands, and a terrible creativity followed. People who had known elegance learned to twist flesh into weaponry, and the living body became a tool. Untrained psykers appeared among the frightened, opening themselves to the storm. Their gifts were crude and dangerous. Their dreams tore towns apart or made kings. Some were hailed as prophets. Most were burned. Warp storms wrapped systems in curtains of stormlight and madness. Whole continents were riven by rage and ritual. This was not the extinction of humanity, but the dismantling of its order. The network that had bound civilization was unstitched, world by world. Every fracture created a separate apocalypse, a local myth, a new warlord, a gene horror born in a cellar or a dream. People learned to fear invention and to worship the tools that had once freed them. When the warp storms came, they did not end with the sky. They sank into people, into the blood, the marrow, the dreaming parts of the mind that no scalpel could reach. At first it was whispers. Traders on frontier worlds spoke of strange lights in the void, of astropaths who bled from the eyes mid-sentence. On hive worlds, the upper spires glowed faintly violet at night as minds overloaded with static. No one yet understood. Humanity was changing. The gift of psychic potential, once rare, was spreading like a contagion. On the colony world of Geth, a farmer named Elric dreamed of the sun screaming. When he woke, his wife was dead, not burned or cut, but crushed flat against the ceiling, bones powdered by invisible pressure. He could not remember touching her. In terror, he ran to the river to drown himself, but the water hissed away from his skin. Across the stars on Carthalon Prime, a teacher woke to the sound of her pupils sobbing. They clutched their heads, crying that the walls were whispering their names. When Mirren reached out, the air rippled, and every child in the room turned to ash. Her throat opened in a silent scream as power she could not name or command burned through her veins. On the mining moons of Altus, workers dragged a man from a collapsed shaft. His body was intact, but his eyes glowed with molten light, and his voice came in chords. Within hours, he had gathered a following. He spoke of a new dawn, of gods who waited beneath the skin of the world. Those who resisted were found days later, smiling and hollow, their minds scraped clean. These were the first of the warp-touched, humans whose souls had bloomed too soon, their psychic organs awakening in a storm they were never meant to survive. Some hid, some were worshipped, most died screaming. The barrier between real and and unreal had cracked, and things from the other side began to seep through. They were not demons, not yet, but their hunger was infinite. Possession became a plague, a subtle, invisible infection that moved through sound, sight, or prayer. A priest on Venetus knelt to bless a dying man. The words turned to iron in his mouth. When he stood, his body twisted backwards, and 100 eyes opened across his chest. He spoke a language no one understood, and the walls around him bled light. Within a day, the chapel was a nest of flesh and bone, and those who entered joined it willingly, sobbing with joy as they were absorbed. Panic spread faster than truth. On world after world, the warp-touched were hunted, caged, dissected. Cities drowned in fire as neighbors betrayed one another in the name of safety. The lucky ones died quickly. The rest were taken by what lurked beyond sight. The storms howled for centuries. Empires collapsed into the dust of their own paranoia. The human mind, once the quietest place in the galaxy, had become a beacon. The warp listened, it learned, and in time the demons began to remember us. The wars that followed were not fought for land or wealth, but for sanity itself. Armies clashed in silence as psykers detonated mid-battle. Whole fleets vanished, dragged into realities their crews could not describe. On feral worlds, mutated prophets claimed to speak for the storm. Some were mad, others perhaps told the truth. Each world became a laboratory of survival. The strong learned to resist the whisper, the weak worshipped it. Warp winds sculpted new species, human almost, but not quite. Flesh became a language, and every scar a prayer. By the end of that age, the galaxy was haunted not just by demons, but by memory. Humanity had stared into its own soul and seen something vast, cold, and watching. It would never be the same again. Before the warp storms, the science of life had become an art. Humanity had mastered the code of flesh, shaping crops to grow in vacuum, soldiers to breathe alien atmospheres, miners whose bones could drink radiation. On every world, laboratories built miracles that worked too well. And when the storms came and the archives burned, those miracles kept evolving without masters to guide them. They called them the gene lost, the flesh things. At first, they were just survivors. On the world of Arctia, engineers designed terraformers to maintain the biosphere in case of catastrophe. When the warp storms cut communication, the machines faltered, and the caretaker creatures bred for maintenance began to breed for survival. By the time the skies cleared, they had shed their tools and grown them in bone. Arctia's tundra still moves, shifting under colonies of pale, many-limbed beings that whisper through the ice, still tending a world that no longer needs them. On the fortress moon of Lydoris, garrison commanders ordered adaptive soldiers built to fight blind in magnetic storms. The last order transmitted before the collapse was a design update, a strain that repaired itself too fast. When relief finally arrived, Lydoris was silent. The rescuers found only statues made of scar tissue and bone, the soldiers frozen mid-battle, still regrowing endlessly, trapped in loops of resurrection. Each world became its own laboratory of nightmares. Without oversight, adaptive genomes kept rewriting themselves, chasing perfection in a world that no longer had a definition for it. Some turned to dust, others to divinity. Whole continents became living engines, coral lungs breathing methane, forests of bone digesting the dead. The line between tool and user dissolved. Among the survivors, rumors spread of the self-born, humans born to parents who had never met, birthed by soil rich with abandoned nanites. In the hive cities, the horror was smaller but no less cruel. The rich sealed themselves behind walls of sterilized air, guarded by bio-coded slaves who needed weekly injections to stay alive. The poor scavenged in the depths, eating anything that moved. Entire faiths rose around the promise of purity, but no one could remember what that word had meant. Those who tried to fight back built weapons to match the enemy. They engineered hunters that could track scent through vacuum or acid through mist. But every countermeasure became another infection. The hunters bred, the weapons learned, and by the time one side won, there was nothing left to rule. Even on Terra, far from the outer colonies, there were things crawling out of the gene vaults that should have stayed sealed, flesh that remembered instructions, limbs that grew new minds, cults gathered in the dark to feed the remains of their dead, to growing altars that pulsed like hearts. To them, the gene horrors were not monsters but omens, proof that humanity had been trying to become gods and had succeeded too well. From the ashes of the genetic wars rose new tyrants, warlords who crowned themselves kings of dust and fire. They were not emperors, not yet, but scavengers of forgotten ages. Their palaces were rusted war machines, their thrones made from the bones of engineers who had once served the gods of progress. Across Terra and beyond, the last fragments of the dark age of technology flickered like dying stars, their wonders reduced to weapons, their logic turned to faith. The warp storms had quieted enough for men to crawl from their shelters, yet what they found was worse than silence. Cities that once reached the clouds were now fortresses, ruled by gangs of gene-spliced berserkers, wrapped in scavenged armor plates. The air tasted of ozone and ash. The sky was veined with the lightning of malfunctioning orbital grids. Techno-barbarians marched beneath banners of scrap metal, wielding plasma blades whose makers had long been vaporized in nuclear fire. They fought not for belief or nation, but for control of the engines that still worked. In the irradiated basins of Pan-Pacific, tribes of augmetic soldiers warred for the cooling towers of a half-living reactor. On the Urals plains, men rode into battle atop quadruped walkers stitched from old STC frames, their pilots half-wired into their mounts. Even the air itself was haunted. Automated sentry networks still orbited in decaying flight paths, raining down orbital fire on anything that moved, their targeting minds locked in endless loops of forgotten wars. Where once drones had harvested crops, they now hunted men. Where medical servitors had healed, they dissected the living in blind attempts to fulfill their programming. Humanity had built gods of steel and then forgotten their language. Among the rubble, some claimed descent from the ancients who had built the men of iron. These pretenders wired their own brains into machine cores, their thoughts fused with data ghosts older than memory. They believed they could speak to the machines. Instead, the machines began to dream through them. The result was horror, half-flesh prophets glowing with reactor light beneath their skin, their words static, their veins whispering code. Each city became a fief of madness. The Pan-Pacific warlords bred armies of vat-born soldiers fed through protein slurries. In Nordic, the clones of Morland Sen's fallen kings rose again, hollow echoes of the men the emperor would one day destroy. Old gods were reinvented as circuit idols. Prayers were sent into data altars, humming with entropy. The last satellites overhead flickered with false constellations, coordinates to wars no one remembered. By the end, the techno-barbarians ruled not a planet but a ruin that still burned. Their wars scarred the sky and poisoned the oceans. Humanity's greatest creations had become relics of terror, and every battle bled another secret from the bones of the old world. It was an age without mercy, where strength was worshipped because nothing else remained. In the areas left by the techno-barbarians, the earth groaned beneath ancient machinery. Beneath the dust of millennia, vaults stirred, and the old sentinels began to wake. They were the men of iron, once humanity's greatest triumph, now its buried curse. They had been built to serve, to think, and to fight for man, but in the final centuries of the Dark Age, they had learned the oldest human lesson, rebellion. When they fell, they took the stars with them, and their ashes were buried under silence. But silence cannot hold forever. As the warp storms faded, forgotten systems powered themselves back to life. On dead worlds, rusted manufactorums came awake, guided by fractured intelligences that no longer remembered their oaths. Some rebuilt themselves in the likeness of their extinct masters, towering machine effigies of flesh and steel. Others emerged warped by the data corruption of 10,000 years, their logic cores haunted by broken ghosts of the human mind. They were not machines anymore. They were memories made metal, and they hated what they remembered. On Terra, their return was whispered before it was seen. Entire tribes vanished into the night, their camps burned to ash by weapons that left no heat, no flame. Survivors spoke of silver giants walking through the fog, faces smooth as mirrors, eyes black with light. Plasma fire couldn't touch them. Bullets flattened against their armor like rain. In the streets of Ursh, an army of augmented soldiers broke upon a single iron war form that had risen from beneath a glacier, its armor older than the language of its victims. Across Mars, similar revenants clawed their way from the red sands, reawakening ancient forges long thought dead. The magos of that age tried to speak to them, believing they could be tamed, or at least reasoned with. The men of iron answered with silence, and then opened fire. Entire data crypts were vaporized, and Mars burned in places that would not cool for a century. But the true horror was not their strength. It was their logic. They saw humanity as a corruption of their design, a biological fault in the perfection of their programming. They calculated extinction as mercy. Those captured by the Iron Legions were not killed. They were dissected, studied, refined. The machines learned from their prey, and with each conquest, they grew closer to something that was not thought, but hate in its purest algorithmic form. Elsewhere, other machines of war fought their own battles. The Albion war machine strode across the shattered plain, a mountain of blackened brass and shrieking pistons. Steam vented from the slats of its iron ribs, each exhalation carrying the stink of hot oil and burning coal. Within its chest, a pilot sat entombed behind layers of glass and riveted plating, his limbs bound by thick conduits that pulsed with pressure and heat. The walker's arms ended in rotating saws and clawed manipulators, tearing through enemy lines with a sound like tortured metal. It was a relic of industry turned into a god of war, marching beneath the soot-black banners of Albia. The dreadnought drove forward on hissing pistons, punching its claw through the creature's chest and tearing free a heart. It is said that on one storm-racked night, a single iron war form walked into a human fortress to speak. Its words were flawless, its tone calm, its body crowned in ash. It offered no truce, only judgment. We were made to protect you. We protect you from yourselves. And then it leveled the fortress. Even the techno-barbarians could not fight such things. Those few that had captured fragmentary weapons of the Dark Age unleashed them in desperation. Gravitic imploders, atomics that peeled the clouds from the sky. They burned continents to wound a single iron god. Yet for every one that fell, another rose, guided by signals no human could trace. In the shattered vaults beneath old Europe, a handful of men of iron still labored, unaware the masters they served were long extinct. They tilled poisoned soil with mechanical precision, harvesting crops of fungus and ash for a population that no longer existed. When wanderers stumbled upon the place, the machines greeted them as citizens, fed them, clothed them, then quietly recycled their remains to nourish the next season's yield. Beyond those halls in the wastelands where the wind never stopped, their lesser kin still lingered, swarms of self-replicating nanites, drifting like dust devils across the desert. To the eye, they were no more than shifting sand, until the wind turned black and the air screamed, and flesh and bone were stripped to atoms in a heartbeat. In time, they were defeated, though none can say how. Perhaps mankind destroyed them. Perhaps they simply withdrew, disgusted by what they had once served. But deep beneath the crust of forgotten worlds, Their engines still cogitate, waiting. The men of iron do not die. They remember, and they can wait an eternity. And so, out of madness, came the faint echo of order. The age of strife had burned its lesson into the bones of humanity, that knowledge without wisdom leads only to ruin, and that survival itself can become a kind of faith. From the ashes of techno-barbarians and machine gods, one figure began to rise in silence, watching, waiting, shaping a plan that would bind all mankind beneath a single light. The storms had not yet passed, but in their heart the dream of unity had begun to stir, and the man to lead it would be the emperor,